Howdy everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Based on History podcast and the segment Things John Got Wrong. And this will be dealing with the things I got wrong in the American Sniper episode. And not to toot my own horn, but I re-listened to it again a couple times and I didn't really hear or find anything that I got really wrong that's really worth kind of talking about or addressing in that much of a capacity. So we're not really going to do a Things John Got Wrong segment here, but one thing I just kind of wanted to talk about is if you're listening to the podcast and you really enjoy it and you have the ability and you're thinking about, advertising your business or anything that you're doing on podcasts, is a great platform to advertise with. And if you're interested in sponsoring or advertising with the Based on History podcast, you can contact me on my Instagram page, which is at Based on History. And I'd love to talk and discuss potential opportunities with you and the podcast as well. So if not, just enjoy the episode and keep listening and spreading the word. That's all I really ask out of anybody who enjoys the podcast, is just to tell as many people as possible about the podcast. So without further ado, we'll dive into the episode itself. This episode is brought to you by Alexis Night Photography. Alexis is an award-winning lifestyle, brand, and wedding photographer based in the Cotswolds, England, specializing in headshots, family shoots, and event photography. Alexis has over 20 years experience. You can find her work and contact her for all your photography needs at alexisnight.co.uk. That's Alexis, KNIGHT.co.uk. We are also brought to you by Design Weaver Textiles. Based in the heart of the Cotswolds, Philippa Weaver of Design Weaver Textiles is a hand-tufted rug designer and maker with a passion for British craftsmanship. With 20 years of experience designing carpet for high-end hospitality, she is uniquely suited to bring a fully bespoke design and make service to you, taking care at each stage to provide a beautiful and truly unique work of art to your interior landscape. You can find her on Instagram at Design Weaver Tex. Again, that's at Design Weaver Tex. We are also brought to you by Vanguard Cattle. Vanguard is a small, family-owned beef operation located in the heart of Texas. Their primary focus is on registered Santa Gertrudis cattle for superior genetics, bull and female replacement for commercial cattlemen and meat production. Vanguard's family roots date back to the days prior to the Republic of Texas. They take much pride in offering strong, sound genetics and beef to other Texas families. You can find them on Instagram and Facebook at Vanguard_cattle or via email at vanguardcattle@gmail.com. Once again, that's at Vanguard_cattle or via email at vanguardcattle@gmail.com. You're listening to the Based on History podcast.
All units, Irene. I say again, Irene.
And we're going to kick him in the ass. We're going to kick the hell out of him all the time, and we're going to go through him like crap through a goose.
You tell them I'm coming, and hell's coming with me, you hear? Hell's coming with me! That they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom! Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained? Is this not why you are here?
Howdy, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Based on History podcast. I'm your host, John Nunick. Joining me, as always, is my wife, Alexis.
Hello.
And today we're going to be talking about the film 300, going over some of the historical facts, and then diving into the movie and seeing the things that they got right and the things that we all know they got wrong. And we'll talk a little bit about the movie like we usually do, and then we'll dive in and look at some of the actual historical events. So, first question, as always, Alexis, your thoughts on the movie? We have both seen this one before. I remember when it came out, but it's been a long time since I've watched it. What are some of your initial thoughts watching it again?
Well, I remember it quite vividly from when I watched it the first time, or at least I remember kind of its cinematic kind of, what's the word? Not influence,
Like the visual?
The visuals, that's what really stood out in my memory. And obviously it's pretty much one battle, so it was clear that was pretty clear that was kind of what had happened, but I couldn't really remember what was leading up to it, or if there was
kind of
the
specifics of it.
Yeah. So your mini helped me understand the history.
Just a reminder, if you haven't listened to the Based on History mini, Ionian Revolt, go do that now. Gives you a little bit of historical context leading up to the movie 300. So, yes, continue.
So yeah, I had a good idea as to what was going on and why this time round. But again, even like I guess maybe this is the second or the third time that I've watched it. And I obviously loved it a lot when I first watched it because I bought the DVD.
Yeah. Yeah, we own it.
Yeah. Which is how we watched it last night. But yeah, and I just thought that visually it was really great. I still like how long ago was it first made?
Yeah, so it came out in 2006, so I would have been,
what's that?
Yeah, like a sophomore in high school.
Just under 20 years ago.
Yeah, so 15 or 16 years old.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought like the way that they filmed it, like the battle scenes, how they'd go into slow-mo and then they'd speed up. That was really cool.
It's visually a very impressive movie.
Yeah, and all the blood and the kind of dramatic blood and gore that come out everywhere, and how grainy and gritty it is, and all of the kind of really amplified stab noises, and all of that was super cool.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when it came out. It was the first movie like this that I really remember. Sin City had come out before.
Oh, had it?
I think. I'm not really sure what year Sin City came out, but it had to have been around the same time. But
yeah, because I remember watching both of those. I can't remember which one was the first, but I remember being like, wow, I've never seen anything like this before.
Sin City has a much more comic booky feel to it, in my opinion, although they're both based off of
similar,
Frank Miller graphic novels. But it was the first movie that kind of was 99% CGI. Everything in it is almost completely... There's very little real structures in the movie. The rest of it's just all CGI.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask that about the location. Was that all kind of studio, pretty much?
Yeah, it's all in a studio.
Yeah.
It's all in, like... There's a few times where they're standing on, like, boulders, but when you look at the production... set pictures, the boulders are all covered in like blue or green.
Oh, right.
So even the things that they're actually interacting.
I was wondering when I was watching it, I was thinking, I wonder if this is all studio, but there were a couple scenes when they were stood on boulders and you could see the ocean behind, and I thought, well, maybe that could be really
that's
on
all
the coast.
No, that's not what the coast looks like, and we'll talk about that when we kind of get to when they arrive at Thermopylae.
But yeah, I liked all the actors. There was nobody that like stood out that I was kind of not into at all. I thought they were all pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, it's by no means would I describe it as like a acting movie. I mean, that's kind of a strange way to say it, but like, it's not, the movie is not really geared towards the acting. It's more geared towards the action and the visuals. Now, I think that everyone who acted in it did a good job, because if you were a bad actor, it would take you out of it, right? But it's not, no one's winning the Academy Award for Best Actor or Actress in the movie 300. So it's more about the battle and the visuals and the technological
Yes.
achievements that they did. But that being said, this is the first movie that I really remember Gerard Butler being the star in. He had some smaller roles and things like that. I remember him in the Dragon movie Reign of Fire with Christian Bale and Matthew McConaughey.
I don't think I've seen that.
Oh well, we need to watch. It's not based on history, so we won't we won't cover it on the podcast. But I actually think it's an underrated kind of futuristic dragon movie. But this was the first time that I remember Gerard Butler being like the number one big guy and kind of launching his career to that next level. And it's got a whole bunch of other characters that you recognize. It's got Lena Headey from Game of Thrones, who plays Cersei. It's got Michael Fassbender in it, kind of right on the cusp of when he.
I think he was my favorite character, apart from Leonidas.
Yeah, he's a cool Spartan.
He was my favorite.
Yeah, he's a cool Spartan. It's got, I can't remember his name, but the guy who plays Faramir in Lord of the Rings. Yeah, the actor who played Xerxes, his name was Rodrigo Santoro. He's in Westworld, and he looks nothing like how he is.
I can't remember which one he is.
Xerxes is the Persian king.
Oh,
the bald guy with all the things.
Yeah, I have to see what he looks like in real life. I'll have a look.
He's heavily CGI'd.
Right. Yeah,
but
he's huge. He's a giant.
Yeah, he's bald. He's painted in gold and covered in baby
and
oil.
Even his voice, they've probably changed that as well.
Yeah. He's completely different. Right. Completely different. But he is in a few other things. He's not quite as big as an actor as some of the other ones. But if you saw him, you'd probably recognize him. He's in a lot of things. So it's got some pretty...
Xerxes, did you say?
Yes.
I thought the king was called something else. King...
So Gerard Butler's called King Leonidas.
Yes.
And then the Persian king is called Xerxes.
Oh, I thought
they refer to him as like the God King and King of Kings and things like that. But his name is Xerxes. Xerxes the First. Is there anything else that stands out to you in the movie?
Well, I mean, I guess I wonder... if I'd seen the movie, I never would have thought it was based on history.
No, yeah, for sure.
I mean, so I'm quite interested to know that. I mean, that's what stood out to me, it must have been a pretty crazy made up story. But
yeah, so we call the podcast the Based on History podcast, and we talk about movies that claim to be based on history. They have done an active job, the producers and the director, to say that this movie is not based on history, and that's why it's so like kind of fanciful and things like that. But I just don't know how you can get around it, because it is most of the main characters are all real characters. The battle is real, the places are real. So they've taken a historical event and historical people, and then they come out and they say, oh, well, it's not based on history, so we can do what we want. It's like, no, I mean, like, I understand you can do what you want. You have artistic license. You can make whatever movie you want, but you can't claim it's not based on history when you've taken an actual historical event and then twisted it, So I just don't really think that claim has good legs, really. It is based on history. It's based on the Battle of Thermopylae. It's based on Leonidas. Okay. It'd be like taking the Normandy landings and then having like laser guns in it and saying like, oh, well, it's not based on history. Right. It's like, well, yeah, that's D-Day. Like we all know what that is. And this is one of the most famous kind of last stand battles in history. So yeah, I mean, I just don't think there's any way around it to say that it's not based on historical events. The one thing that I remember standing out about this movie right off the bat, or two things really, is one, how jacked they all are. Mm-hmm. And I
think they did some personal training before that.
And two, the amount of blood and gore that was in the movie. And I remember it kind of being a little bit of outrage from parents and things like that about how much blood and gore was, how graphic it really was. And then, of course, that making every, like, high school teenage kid want to see it even more. And the about how jacked they are, I watched a couple of videos on like their training regiment that they did and this personal trainer that they brought in to train all the Spartans. And apparently most of the movie is all CGI'd, and apparently none of the muscles are CGI'd other than like glossing
Okay. I mean,
them
I
up.
thought they looked pretty real to me.
Yeah, they're all just huge, just massively jacked.
Mm-hmm.
And they did this training regiment where I forgot how long it lasted, but it was like months. They were preparing for this role for months, and every single day was a different full workout, so that your muscles were you're never working at the same muscles in a row, and you're working out every single muscle group. And it was all, and I watched, they're doing crazy CrossFit and just weird out of the box style things. Yeah, and they're all just massively shredded. Very, very cool. The other thing that I remember about this movie is the cultural impact it had once it came out. I mean, there was Spartan stuff everywhere. Everywhere you look, there was,
No, I don't remember that.
It's like, from people dressing up in Halloween costumes to parody movies to T-shirts with like kind of, especially that the military really gravitated towards this movie, and you started seeing Spartan-inspired things all over the place, from just like little logos on T-shirts to patches that were on uniforms, all sorts of things. I mean, you could go into any like kind of like novelty store in the mall or anything like that, and there would be 300 Spartan everything you could buy: swords, shields, helmets.
So then that's I guess my first question about the accuracy is the costumes. Were they accurate?
No.
Okay.
No, I mean there are some things about. That's just a good segue to kind of get in some of the things that they got wrong right off the bat. There are some things about the costumes, specifically the Spartans, that they got right. Their spears, more or less, look like what the spears would look like during that time. The spears that the Spartans would have been using in history, they're about 8 feet long, and the spearhead would look more or less like that. And then they have that kind of metal ball spike on the end. That's what is called the lizarder, and that's for like killing wounded soldiers on the ground. A counterbalance.
The lizarder. Why is it called that?
That's just the name for it.
They must have a reason.
I'm sure they do. I kind of tried to find out, and they just said like everything I found just said this is what it's called. This is what it's called in the translation and everything like that. But the spear's pretty accurate. The shields, more or less, are fairly accurate. The size and shape and how they kind of hold them is accurate. What's not accurate about the shields is that in the movie they're portrayed as all bronze. It's a completely bronze shield. It would have been a wooden shield with bronze covering over it.
Right.
And then also the Spartans have that lambda, that kind of, all of their shields have that kind of triangle that go across the shield. That's the symbol for Sparta. And every Spartan has a lambda on their shield. Now at this time period, we're not exactly sure if the Greek city-states were doing that, because every Greek city-state had their own little symbol that they would put on their shield. And they're not sure if the Spartans in the other states were doing that at this time, or if it was more like your family crest or your family emblem or a personal symbol or something like that. Okay. So they very well could have done. It just probably wouldn't have been as completely uniform.
So there's no remaining shields from this time, are there?
Not from this time. They do have some Greek city-state shields, but everything we kind of know about warfare for the Greek city-states is from a later period of time.
So what time did this all take place?
So the Battle of Thermopylae takes place in 480 BC. So about 10 years after the end of that Ionian Revolt episode that I had done. Okay. The Battle of Marathon and that second Greek invasion about 10 years later when the Persians come back. Right. So going back to the kind of the costumes, yeah. The helmets that the Spartans are wearing they're obviously based on history. They're influenced by historical Greek city-state helmets, but there are no helmets that look like that. And the Spartans weren't wearing helmets like that. At the Battle of Thermopylae, the helmets that they would have been wearing would have, everything's so uniform for them in the movie, and that's just so you can distinguish the Spartans from the Persians, and so they all look cool and everything like that. But you would have seen a whole bunch of different type of helmets. The kind of Corinthian helmet that have you seen the movie Troy with Brad Pitt? Yeah. The kind of helmet that Brad
in Malta.
What?
That was filmed in Malta. I've been to where they filmed part of that.
That's very cool. But the helmet that Brad Pitt's character wears. It's kind of got those cheek pieces that kind of come down, and it's very narrow eye slits. That's even that itself is a Hollywood interpretation of a Corinthian helmet, but those were in style, and they were kind of coming towards the end of their kind of heyday at this time. But you definitely would have seen some of those style helmets at the Battle of Thermopylae. Some more open face ones that just have like a very slender nose piece, and then cheek pieces that kind of hang down. You would have seen all sorts of different types of helmets and even armor. We'll talk about the armor in just a second.
Would the king have had that plume?
So he probably did have a plume, but also pretty much everyone else probably would have had a plume. A lot of these things depend on how much money the individual soldier had, because everything was supplied by himself.
Right.
And so if you're a super rich Spartan, you're going to have the top of the line helmet, you're going to have the top of the line armor and things like that. And speaking of armor, in the movie, they're all wearing leather Speedos and like a red cape and nothing else. Every single Spartan would have been wearing some type of body armor.
See, I was thinking these guys are clever. One, because it's warm, they don't want to get hot. And two, because they'll be more agile without the heavy armor.
Well, they would be more agile without the armor, but they also would have died a whole lot faster.
Yeah, well, that's what I was thinking. Wow, they're just super, super good at using their shields.
The shield is obviously the main part of their armor, the way they fight, and we'll talk about the way they fight as well. But they would have been wearing some type of breastplate or cuirass or something like that, and it would have either been made out of bronze, or it would have been made. There's this type of armor called a lenothorax, and it's like woven or glued linen or fabric of some kind. Leather is used, and then they kind of sometimes put scales on it, and it's all one piece. But you put it on and it kind of folds together around you, and then it kind of like ties in the center or kind of ties over the shoulders and then ties along kind of like the rib cage kind of area.
You wouldn't get to see their buff torsos.
Yeah, exactly. It's all, yeah, if you work out for 6 months to get jacked and then cover it up with armor, then you don't see any of the muscles. But they would have all been wearing some type of breastplate. They would have all been wearing some type of greaves, like the kind of things that protect like your arms. And then they would have been wearing like some type of shin protection and things like that. So the thing about the hoplite, which is what the individual soldier in the Greek city-states is called, like you would call like a Marine or, like a paratrooper.
So one of those Spartans is a hoplite.
Yes. Yeah, so each individual soldier is a hoplite. The thing about them is they are heavy infantry. They are heavy infantry, which means they're going to be covered in armor. They're not light troops. And so, essentially, in the movie, they're light troops because they wear almost no armor. They don't even wear any clothes. Even when they're, like, in the forum talking about politics and things like that, they have, like, a shawl over it, and then you can tell that they're just naked, yeah.
I just thought, well, they're in Greece.
It's hot.
Probably realistic.
Yeah. But... So, they would have been wearing armor of some kind, but the spear and the shield are more or less correct. The helmets are influenced, although they don't really look the same. But the Sparta's color is red. The Spartans are known for wearing the red capes.
That stands out really, really well as well.
Yes, there's historical records of other armies fleeing just because they saw like the red capes and the lambda on the shield. They didn't even fight the Spartans. They just knew the Spartans were coming in, and then they fled. Of course, that's later on in time. Most of the historical records, but they were known for that. So they very well could have been wearing red capes, and they very well could have had the lambdas.
What about their shoes? Were they accurate?
The sandals that they were wearing, I guess. I mean, I don't really know all that much about ancient sandals, but I don't know. I have no idea about their sandals, but I do know that
they would have been flat-footed sandals, not with the arch, because that came later.
Oh, you mean like heels and things like that?
No, you know how you'd mentioned recently about how all shoes were flat-footed.
Used to be. Yes, they would have been flat sandals. Okay. No arch support on those sandals. But I did look up and read a little bit about what Spartan women would wear, and what Lena Headey's character is wearing is obviously not historically accurate. She looks like She's the stripper version.
She's gone to that toga party.
Yeah, she's gone to a toga party. But Spartan women did wear pretty scandalous clothing. And it would have gone over the shoulders and basically like a really skinny poncho. And it just would have had a head hole in the middle, and it would have just gone down either side, and then they would have belted it in the middle. So basically from both sides, all the double slits all the way.
Naked sides.
Yeah, you basically see naked sides, arms bare. So they are wearing fairly, little bit of clothing.
Not very modest.
Not very, yeah, but I mean, like their breasts would have been covered,
Yeah.
Her character in the movie, it's like cleavage all the way down to her belly button and, weaving fabric all over and everything like that. But it's just kind of a fanciful version of it. Just kind of a cool little tidbit about women's fashion in Sparta.
I was going to say, actually, the scene that stood out for me that didn't make sense to me was that final fight where they just all die. And they had fought, and they were like unkillable up until that moment, and then all of a sudden they just all get killed.
Yeah.
It just kind of felt like they had these little like battle formations that they were doing with the way that they would use their shields, and they were so organized, and then all of a sudden they were just all sort of flailing around, like not using their shields as protection and just all getting shot with arrows. So it was like, well, why now are they getting killed in that way? But why weren't they killed in that way a little bit earlier?
Yeah, so I mean, in the movie, it's all kind of different, but they do all die. Spoiler alert. All of the Spartans do die.
And what about the one? Does the one survive?
So actually, 2 Spartans survive. We'll talk about them after the battle, but 2 Spartans survive the battle for different reasons, but they're not there at the very end.
Okay.
He gets sent away.
Yes.
2 Spartans get sent away before the last stand. They survive the Battle of Thermopylae. So now we'll kind of just go into the kind of chronological events, and then we'll kind of hit on things as we come along to them. So we'll start with the beginning of the movie is the Persian messengers riding into Sparta and asking for them to submit for earth and water and that. So that did happen almost, very, very closely to how it's portrayed
So they killed those messengers.
They kill the messengers. The only thing that happens differently is that it happens many years before. It happens before that. But they do kick them down a well. The Athenians, who they talk about, also, they throw them off a cliff or something like that. So they do reject the Persian, envoy,
right,
and kill them. But then that's kind of like bad karma to kill a messenger, because they're just bringing the message. And so the Spartans actually send some Spartans to Persia to be like, hey, you can kill our messengers so that we get the we can get the karma back. And the Persians are like, no, we don't want bad karma either. So they're just like, go home, go away. But
that's crazy.
But what that effectively does is put Sparta at war with Persia, and all of Greece as well. Persia already wants to come back to destroy Athens for supporting the Ionian revolt, and they tried it once and failed, so they're coming back with an even larger army. And
so what I'm confused about is I thought that the Persians were coming and heading. I thought this bit was on their way to Athens, not to Sparta.
It is.
Okay, so because they made a comment in the movie that that the Athenians had rejected them or something. I can't remember what, but it was kind of seemed like they had already fought the Athenians and were on their way. Like, why were the Spartans?
Right. So
Sparta is after Athens, isn't it?
Yes. So that's why it doesn't line up historically very well, because this event happens before the second Persian invasion of Greece. So when they come and have that battle of Marathon, and then the Athenians beat them and push them out and they go back to Persia, this event where they kill the messengers happens before that battle of Marathon.
Okay.
In the movie, they make it seem like this is what leads up to the Battle of Thermopylae. But really, it's years before that. And so Sparta and the rest of Greece are kind of starting to gear up for war with Persia. They know they're coming back. They killed their messengers. Athens is still there. And so the Persians are coming back for the third invasion of Greece under Xerxes.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Okay, I think so.
So in the movie, you're right. It doesn't really make sense because you're saying, well, I thought this already happened, and it did. But just the scene where they killed the messengers happened years before the Battle of Thermopylae. They just do it because it's dramatic for the movie and to show that this is kind of the beginning of Sparta getting ready for war with Persia.
Okay.
So they're already at war with Persia, and so the movie just kind of dramatizes it and kind of closes it together just so that it looks, more dramatic.
Okay.
So at this point in time in 480 BC, the Greek city-states are all starting to prepare for war with Persia. They know that the Persians are coming. And so all of the Greek city-states, which are their own little independent kingdoms, get together and kind of have a council of war and decide that they are going to defend Greece from the Persian invasion. And they start talking about where they are going to do this. And they first decide that they're going to defend this area called the Vale of Tempe, which is kind of a pass through the mountains. But then they realize there's another pass around it. They wouldn't be able to defend it. So then they settle on Thermopylae. This is decided by all of the Greek city-states. And an Athenian named Themistocles is kind of the one who it's his brainchild. They're going to defend the pass at Thermopylae, and they're going to defend at sea and have a naval battle.
So it wasn't just 300 Spartans that decided to defend that area?
No, yeah, this was all of the Greek city-states together. In the movie, they make
Right.
it seem like it's just Sparta alone, and they're the only ones that do it. But all of the Greeks decide that they are going to do this together.
Right, okay.
So down at the Straits of Corinth, that little tiny strip of land that connects the, kind of where Sparta is, the Peloponnese, to the
Yes.
rest of Greece, some Greeks go down there and they start building a wall across that little strait, that little strip of land.
Oh,
So
yeah,
that
and
the-
you said that there's some kind of evidence that there's still some remains left of that wall.
I think there's still some remains. Now they built a canal through it so that ships could go through there, and there's bridges over it. But at the
Right.
time, it was just all connected. You could
Okay.
walk across it. But so the Spartans are going to go up to Thermopylae with some allies and defend the pass at Thermopylae, and the Athenians and a few of the other allies with their ships are going to go to this place called Artemisia and have a naval battle with the Persian naval forces. And so it's a two-pronged defense, both using the natural landscape of the area to funnel in the Persian masses to negate their numbers.
Okay.
And so around this time it's like late August, early September timeframe. And that's when the Greeks have the Olympic Games and all of their festivals and things like that. And so the Greeks can't go to war during that time. It's just part of their law. And so King Leonidas does go to the oracle at Delphi to seek guidance from them. So in the movie, he climbs up there and he's talking to those weird,
Those mystics.
yeah, the mystics, and they've got the girl doing the dance and everything like that. That's in Delphi, which is not near Sparta. It's up in mainland Greece. Okay. And so that's another reason why things take a little bit longer, because it all happens kind of in 481 to 480 within that year time frame. He travels they have the Council of War. He travels to Delphi. He seeks the oracle, and the oracle tells him something similar. It's not quite don't go to war, but it's kind of if you go to war, you'll die, but you'll save Sparta. It's all kind of mystic, oracle-y. It can be interpreted multiple ways, as they always are. So basically.
And were the oracles really those kind of young women that were basically trafficked rape victims?
So in the movie, they make it seem like these guys are abusing these women, and they probably were, and they did take the most beautiful women. It's not just in the movie, they say the most beautiful women from Sparta. Delphi's not in Sparta, so they did take a lot of beautiful young women and make them oracles. And the oracle at Delphi, you can go to the remains of the temple at Delphi, and it's there used to be, or they don't really know. Historians don't really know why, but the oracle were these girls would get high on fumes from the earth, and then they would dance and speak in tongues that could only be interpreted by
and
those
these just any old beautiful women that they take.
I mean, I guess
they don't have to have any kind of like special psychic gifts before they're picked.
No, yeah, no, the psychic gifts and things like that come from like the fumes that were released from the, and there are kind of like sulfuric like pockets down there, but they don't really know exactly how they got high and interpreted in these things. So they very well could have been like using some type of smoking spice or something like that. But King Leonidas does go there and to seek, advice from them. But they can't go to war because it's their Carnia, which is like their harvest festival. The Olympic Games are going on. And so King Leonidas decides he is going to take his 300 personal bodyguard and head up to Thermopylae to defend the pass. He does get some support from Thebes and Thesbia. In the movie, it's Arcadia, which is another region in the Peloponnese near Sparta. And they do help, but not at the Battle of Thermopylae.
Okay.
So King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans. Now, so something that's never said in the movie, not represented at all, is that Spartan culture, all of the men are soldiers. Now, they do talk about that, right? They had that scene where he's like, I brought more soldiers than you. But the thing that allowed the Spartan men to all be soldiers is the heavy reliance on slavery in Sparta. I mean, there were very few free Spartan men in Sparta compared to the slave population in Sparta.
Okay.
And the slave population in Sparta had different levels. There's certain ones that are like almost free. You can make money, that you could buy your freedom. You just can't vote and have the same rights. And then they have a couple other layers at the bottom of this population called the Helots. And they were a conquered people that were basically like chattel slaves. And their whole entire job was to serve the Spartan warriors. So in each Spartan warrior had like between 3 and 7 Helots that attended to them. So like when they're marching, the Spartan men are not carrying their sword or their spear and shield. The Helots are carrying it for them.
Because I think that they made the comment in the movie that they were once slaves, but it seemed like that they were all free people now, which is why they were so anti having the Persians take them as slaves.
Right. So that's talking back to their like mystic history of like archaic, mythological Sparta. Is used to be slaves. We broke free and freed ourselves. He's not talking about what's ongoing in Sparta right now. It didn't happen recently. Sparta's been its own city-state for a while, and the Spartans' culture has been established. So the Spartan men themselves have been free for a long time. No one who was alive at that point as a Spartan soldier or citizen was a slave. So he's talking about like their history.
Right, okay.
But when the Spartans march off to war, there would have been a massive, even bigger group of people marching behind them that were their like slaves, their Helots.
I see, okay.
So when 300 Spartans go to war, it's really like, 900 to 1,000, people marching because of all of the slaves that would have been coming with them. So they meet up with the Thesbians and the Thebans to help defend the pass. And now we'll talk about Thermopylae itself for a little bit. Thermopylae now looks nothing like it did during that time period. The gulf that is there, the silt that's kind of been filtered in there, has changed the landscape massively. At the time of the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC, the water of that gulf would have come right up to where the battlefield is. And there's a road that you can drive past the battlefield, and there's some monuments on one side. They're pretty sure that the water would have come right up to that road. And so that whole entire stretch of coastline between the mountains and what the water would have been during this time period, in some areas is less than 100 yards wide. And in a couple areas, it's like this.
So did they represent that well with the CGI?
No.
Not... Okay.
In some ways, yes. They make it very narrow. But it would look nothing like that. There is no big cliff. It's just a beach in the water, which is still a natural defense against cavalry and chariots and large formations of men getting around your flank and things like that. But they wouldn't have been able to like push them off a cliff and kill them when they fall into the sea and stuff like that. And also, that's what's misrepresented in the movie is the hot gates itself. They come in that little narrow mountain pass at the beginning, and they build the wall that goes from the gate to the cliff. So they do build a wall, which is called the Phocian Wall. And this was built hundreds of years earlier by the Phocians, which are the people that lived in that area against, they were at war with another Greek city-state at that time. And so the Spartans and their allies do rebuild the Phocian Wall. But in the movie, it looks like this wall blocks the path that goes around it, and therefore the Persians have to go into this like canyon that's there. There is no canyon like that there. The hot gates themselves only refer to the fact that there's these 3 areas along the coastline that get funneled into a small area. And then the hot part of the hot gates comes from the hot springs that are in that area. So there's like, from the sulfur and the like volcanic activity, it's like heated water that comes down in like a little spring and like a little creek that goes down to the ocean. And so that's where the term hot gates come from. There is no actual gate. There is no actual canyon. It's just the fact that in certain areas, there's easily defensible spots that you can kind of post up and stop an army. So that part of the movie is wrong. There is an area close by there that looks similar, and I think a lot of people have gone there and thought, oh, this must be the hot gates. But really, it's just a narrow strip of land in between the mountains and the water.
Okay.
And so what the Spartans and their allies do is they rebuild the Phocian Wall, but from what we can tell, they never did that kind of like funneling act that they do in the movie. All of the fighting takes place on the out front of the wall. So the wall is just kind of extra protection. There is a little gap in between kind of like the mountainside and the wall itself, so that the Spartans can get in and out from like where their camp is behind the wall, and then kind of get out into the area. But almost all of the fighting is done in flat open ground in front of the wall. The funneling act is just from the natural landscape itself, because the Spartans need room as well to maneuver. And we'll talk about the way the Spartans fight. The way the Greek, and not just Sparta, but the Greek city-states itself. So the Greek city-states, they all fight in what's known as a phalanx. And they really only show that at the opening battle in the movie. When they're in the line, they've got their shields, and then they're in that kind of, that spear.
Well, they're kind of like pushing with their shields and then stabbing, and then pushing with their shields and stabbing.
Right. And so that's more or less how a phalanx works. And the Spartans would have never, under any circumstances, unless they had like lost the battle and were retreating, but during the battle itself, would have never broken that formation. That is where the power of their entire military strategy comes from. So when they break out and they're doing all their ninja moves and their individual fighting, and they're, killing Spartans left and right with their swords and things like that, it would have never been like that. It would have always been the Spartan phalanx. Work together
as one unit.
Yes, and that is the whole point of their training. It's the whole point of the military armament that they have. We don't, and like I said, we don't exactly know how the Greek phalanx worked at this time, because all of our historical records come from a later date. But we do know that they were fighting in the phalanx at this time. So it wouldn't have been individual soldiers running out on their own.
Well, Leonidas did make that suggestion that was how they fought when he was talking to that hunchback.
Yes,
guy.
He talks about it, and they do it in the movie. But then after that initial scene, they're just they just break formation and run around like a bunch of, madmen. So you can see all of the muscles and things like that.
Did that guy exist? That one that the weird-looking hunchback guy.
Ephialtes or
what his name was.
Yeah, he existed, but he was not a Spartan reject.
Okay.
Or a hunchback. He was just a local, and some people think he was like a goat farmer or something like that. He's been portrayed as a goat farmer before. Okay. But he is a traitor, and he is the one that tells the Persians, hey, there's this path. Yeah. Right. But in real life, the Spartans arrive there and they're making their preparations for this battle. They know that the path is there, and they send a force to block it. There's a force of Phocians, who are the local people there. There's a Greek hoplite contingent blocking that pass. So we'll talk a little bit about Spartan culture, and then we'll get into the battle itself. In the movie, they talk about these things, and they more or less portray it, factually accurate. The Spartans would discard any babies that were disformed or unhealthy or sickly or anything like that. And in the movie, they show that hunchback guy, but and saying like, okay, well, you would see, okay, if they had a baby like that, they're going to throw it off the cliff.
But they kind of explained in the movie that the only reason he survived was because of his mother's love, and she fled with him.
Right, but I'm saying is that, like, in your mind, you're like, oh, disfigured babies like that get discarded. But in real history, like, it could be something as small as, like, a birthmark that a priest deemed like a bad omen. Right, or something like that. Wow. So, I mean, there are all these random, weird scenarios where Spartan babies would just get, like, discarded.
Oh, my goodness.
And then they kind of go into Leonidas' training that and it's called the agoge. And every single Spartan male, except for the firstborn son of the king, and even some of them went through it anyways, would go through this agoge, which is the training that starts at 7 years old, and then it ends when you're 20, I think. And then between 20 and 30, you kind of earn your spot, and then at 30, you're a full-fledged Spartan male citizen.
So why does the king's firstborn son not do that?
Not do what?
The agoge.
Because boys die during it. It's very, very hard on them. They aren't fed. They have to fight and fend for themselves. And so your next king could possibly die.
So was Leonidas not the firstborn son?
No, he was not.
Okay.
So his dad, who was king before him, had 3 sons from 2 different wives. Leonidas is the second son of his first wife. Both of his older brothers, so his half-brother and his full brother, become king of Sparta. Or, excuse me, only one of them does. One of them becomes king. The other one tries to become king but flees. He dies later on.
So how is he the second son if he's got 2 older brothers? Wouldn't that not make him the third son?
He's the second son from the king's first wife.
Okay.
So he is technically the third son of the king of Sparta at that time. But Leonidas' father's oldest son becomes king, but he's removed from power for, I think, like, being insane. And then Leonidas' second older brother dies in exile. And so that's why Leonidas becomes king, and that's why Leonidas is one of the few Spartan kings that also went through the agoge. Yeah. Okay. So he's got the training.
So that's not normal.
Not normal, although there are historical records of the king's sons, firstborn, going through it at certain points in time. But overall, not the norm. So that's why Leonidas is viewed as this great leader and great soldier. And at that council of war, Leonidas is chosen to lead the army at Thermopylae. It's not just because he himself is going there with his Spartans by themselves. He's seen as a good leader by all the Greeks, as a good warrior by all of the Greeks.
But just not at that specific... They just didn't want him at that specific time to go. Is that right?
So the movie makes it seem like Sparta says, no, you can't go. But that... And they kind of have that subplot with the council, kind of scheming behind his back and things like that. That's all just kind of made up. So he can't take the whole army because of the festival and the Olympic Games, but it's never like kind of in contention that he's going to go, and he's always going to go. Everyone knows he's going to go and defend Thermopylae. So we get to the first day of the battle because the Spartans and their allies get there first.
Sorry, one more question about so they have that training that they go through. And they also mention in the movie that the 300 that he chooses to take, they've all got wives or all got children.
They've all got children.
They've all got children. So was that a for real thing?
I think so. Yeah, I can't remember exactly, but I remember reading something about that. His 300. They all have sons to replace them and things like that. But so we get to the first day of the battle. And the Persians come up to them and they ask them to submit. And they basically say, lay down your arms. And the Spartans reply with, come and take them. Which they would have said, molon labe. And that's a real line. So in the movie...
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, so the Spartans are known for their one-liners. They say them all of the time, and part of that agoge training is being taught how to speak what's called laconically, and that is the Spartan wit, is the short, sarcastic one-liners that they are taught basically in school to reply to people. So that when
are our soldiers today taught these one-liners or taught this wit?
We usually just take them from movies
Okay.
like 300. But the come and take it line was also used by the Texas forces in the Texas Revolution at a certain battle. There was a cannon that the Mexicans wanted to take from them, and they made a flag with a cannon on it and said, "Come and take it."
Right.
And at the battle, and this is directly from the Spartans at Thermopylae.
That's cool.
Almost all of the kind of cheesy one-liners that are said in the movie are actually said by the Spartans. So like whenever the one guy gets his arm cut off by Michael Fassbender, he says, our arrows are so numerous they'll blot out the sun, and he goes, "We'll fight in the shade." That's a real line. So they they actually said that, and they have lines like that throughout history. When Alexander the Great's father is conquering Greece with his Macedonians, he sends a letter to the Spartans and said, "If I come down there, I'll destroy you." And the Spartans send a one-word answer back to Philip, and it just says, "If." Like, and they're not even powerful at this point in time. They have no real influence other than like their little area, and they're still
kind of like psychological warfare.
Yeah, a little bit. So they say, they do the come and take it line, and it's said that Xerxes' army is, Herodotus, who is our main guy who tells us about this.
Yes.
It exaggerates everything. He says the Persian army is like 2 to 3 million men. Modern estimate.
So hang on a minute. That Herodotus guy, you were talking about the guy in the mini. Was that who you're talking about? This one guy that survives the 300?
No.
Oh,
no.
so this is a different guy.
Yeah, Herodotus is a Greek historian.
Oh, okay, all right. So that's
who was alive in and around this time.
Okay.
Who came out with something called the Greek Histories, and he tells from like the mythological age.
Okay.
All the way up to past kind of.
I see. So you're not talking about the narrator of.
No. The narrator in the movie, the Faramir's character, he's based on a real Spartan that survived the battle. And I don't know if he was a storyteller or whatnot, but that's kind of his character. But Herodotus says the Persians are in the millions of men. We know that the Persian army could not have been that just from a logistical standpoint, but they're pretty sure it was in the hundreds of thousands.
Okay.
It's a massive army. So we're looking at somewhere between like 100 and 300,000 Persians versus roughly 7,000 Greek city-states.
So how many to one is that?
I don't do the math.
You should have done the math before this.
Yeah, I'm not the math guy.
I've got a tired brain today. I can't do the math.
We'll cut that part out. Thanks for that. But so it's a massive number of Persians versus a very small number of Spartans and their allies. And on the first day of battle, the Persians are said to have sent 10,000, like 2 groups of 10,000 men against the Spartans. And it's the Medes and some of the other groups of Persians. And the Spartans and their allies stop them. And they fight, apparently they just destroy them. They are ineffective against the phalanx, and the Persian arrows are ineffective against the heavy armor of the hoplites. So then they retreat. The second wave that come in are known as the Immortals. And in the movie, they show this. They show the Immortals coming. And in the movie, they look like ninjas.
Yeah, the guys in the black costumes and the masks.
Yeah, and some of their masks come off and they look like monsters and things like that.
Yes.
Obviously they weren't monsters. They were just regular men. But the reason why they're called the Immortals is that it's a group of 10,000 trained full-time soldiers of the Persian army. Historians talk about what that actually means, and the little details. Is it a personal bodyguard, or is it just a group of men that are professional soldiers? They're not exactly sure, but regardless, they're the elite wing of the Persian army, and they're called Immortals because anytime one guy dies, they find someone to replace him. So the number is always at 10,000.
Okay, wow.
And so the myth of them spreads throughout the empire and areas, and they're like, oh my goodness, these guys, they're immortal. And so the immortals come in, and they can't break the phalanx either. This is all on day one. And so then now the immortals retreat. Well, now we kind of get to the second day of battle. And the second day of battle starts off pretty much exactly how it is in the first day. Xerxes sends a ton of men against the Spartans, and they fare no better than the day before. They retreat again. They try and parlay with the Spartans again. It fails, and Xerxes and the Persians are trying to figure out a way to defeat this army. Real quick, at the same time that the Battle of Thermopylae is going on, there's another naval battle with the Athenians going on in the Straits of Artemisium, which is the subject of the sequel to 300, the 300 Rise of Empire.
Okay.
It takes place, and we'll do that movie later on. But just know that there's one of the reasons why the Persians don't have any support from the sea is because the Athenian navy is keeping the Persian army at bay.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's an important part to why the Spartans are able to just hold them, and they don't have to worry about any of the ships or anything like that. So in the movie, when they show the Persians landing at that bay, there would have been probably almost no ships there, because this army marched all the way around on the land. The second day doesn't go well for the Persians again, and they're trying to figure out a way. This is when the traitor comes up to Xerxes and tells him about the path that goes around the mountains so that they can outflank and come around from the rear of the Spartans and the allies. In the movie, it's the hunchback, and he's spurned by Leonidas because he can't raise his shield, which I always find funny in the movie, because he's like, clear the dead of the battlefield and bring us water if you want to help, and he gets mad and runs away. Well, then when he goes into such detail about how important the phalanx is, but then after that first engagement, no one's fighting in the phalanx.
What a hypocrite.
Yeah, and when you look at them in the phalanx, there's like 5 or 6 guys walking behind the phalanx, killing all of the wounded Persians on the ground. He could have been doing any of that. Or they had, in the movie, they have the Acadians. He could have fought with them.
He could have had a place.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. a fighting place.
Exactly, yeah. He could have had a fighting place that wouldn't have interfered with the precious phalanx that Gerard Butler's talking about. And in the movie, they wouldn't have had to worry about the traitor,
Would the Persians have had giants and rhino riding people?
No. That's all fake. All that stuff is fake. There is, they didn't have elephants. Elephants, one, eat a ton. So when you're going on that long of a campaign, you're not going to bring elephants and rhinos with you. Rhinos aren't trainable either. You can't.
I didn't think so. I didn't know that anyone could ride a rhino.
No. And all the kind of like grenades that they're using, they're throwing
those magical people.
Yeah, that didn't happen either.
Okay, so they weren't like a third wave of people that they sent.
No, yeah. There's the battle. They add a whole bunch of stuff to make it more dramatic during the battle, but none of that stuff happened. Now there are some accounts of the Persians trying to use cavalry and chariots on the Persians. I mean, excuse me, on the Spartans. We don't exactly know when they did this, but they did try it. But because everything is so narrow, it negated the ability of the maneuverability of the cavalry and the chariots, and it was just ineffective as well.
Okay.
So everything the Persians have tried has failed. But the traitor, who's either a goat herder or a spurned Spartan hunchback, we don't know. He goes to Xerxes and tells him about this path that goes around the mountains, basically for reward. Some type of money and reward. And the Xerxes sends what's remaining of the immortals around this path at night. And so the Phocians who are up there defending it hear them coming, and they retreat to a little hill thinking that they're going to fight the immortals, but the immortals just kind of leave a contingent there to keep them pinned down and then keep on going so that they can get around the backside of the Spartans. And so the Phocians send a runner to the Spartans to let them know, hey, you're being outflanked. And so by around the morning of the third day of battle, they know they're about to get surrounded. And so Leonidas sends the rest of the allies away from the battlefield. And he has decided that he is going to stay and cover their retreat. Now, there's some historical debate as to why he does this. Because a lot of people think like, oh, he's going to sacrifice himself so that Greece can have time to get an army together and things like that. And cover all of Greece. And that doesn't really make sense. But what does make sense is that he's going to allow the other allies that are there to escape so that they can fight again. That's basically why he stays to sacrifice him and his men in this kind of last stand. Now, a few of the allies say, "Hey, we're staying too." It's one of the contingents is from an area that has been conquered by Persia already, so they don't have a home. They say, "Hey, we're going to stay and fight." And
didn't he say something like the Spartans never give up, although they never? What did he state about the Spartans fighting till the end?
No, they don't retreat.
Okay.
And there is some kind of evidence to the Spartans not retreating and kind of wanting to die in battle. They do kind of have that like kind of Viking-esque mentality of dying in battle as the glorious death and things like that.
Samurai.
Yeah, kind of like that kind of mythos that's around certain groups of warriors. But throughout history, the Spartans retreat. You know, if they're losing a battle, the Spartans retreat. So his last stand is a self-sacrifice because Spartan armies have retreated before.
Okay.
And he is going to allow the rest of the men to get back to their areas to be a part of the army to fight the Persians again. So they retreat. A few of the contingents do stay to fight with the Spartans. And all of those helots, those slaves, they would have been there too. So there is still, it's not just the 300 that are there at the very, very end. But after the morning on the third day, the Spartans are completely surrounded on both sides. And the Persians attack, and Leonidas gets killed in the fighting. So he dies at the beginning of the battle on the last day, the last stand. There's a massive fight for the body of Leonidas, but the Spartans are able to recover it, and they fall back behind the Phocian wall. The Persians begin to tear down the Phocian wall, and the Spartans are holding them off. And then that's kind of when the immortals get around behind them or show up on the battlefield. And so the Spartans and the remaining allies retreat to this little hill that's still there today. It's just kind of behind the Phocian wall, and they form up in a circle and kind of do their last stand there. Now, some of the allies, the Thebans, they surrender to the Persians because they were kind of off by themselves fighting, and then later on they get made slaves of the Persians.
Right.
The last stand is on this hill, and the Persians are said to have just rained arrow fire and wore them down. They're weary of battle. They've lost some men, all those types of things. Their spears have been broken. There's accounts of the Spartans fighting with their swords and rocks and their teeth and their hands until the last one is killed. And every single one of them dies, except for the two that we talked about earlier. And they get sent away because they're wounded badly. So in the movie, he gets like a sword across the eye, and he gets sent away to spread the word and the message. Really, he did get wounded in the eye, so he does lose an eye, and they don't really know how. Some say it's like an infection of some kind. He gets sent away. Oh, so I take that back. Really, 3 Spartans survive the battle, but one of them sees the last stand and like runs back, and he dies in the fight. He's like this hero of Sparta for sacrificing himself. The other 2 that get sent away because
Hang on a minute. Sorry, he sees the last stand and runs away, but gets killed. So he's not.
No, he runs back to the battle.
Oh, okay.
I don't know at what point during the last stand it is, but like they're leaving, and he's like, no, I'm going to stay. So he runs back, and he's killed during the battle.
Okay.
The other 2 that get sent away are seen as they're in disgrace because they let all of their friends die.
Okay.
Even though they were wounded and sent away by the king, they're kind of ostracized in Sparta. One of them commits suicide because he can't take the shame of not dying in battle. The other one, the one with the eye patch, he is there at that end battle that they show in the movie. It's called the Battle of Plataea. and he fights at the Battle of Plataea to regain his honor, and kind of regains his honor, but also dies in the battle.
Okay.
So, but all the Spartans and the allies that are at this last stand hill, they all die. The Helots, it would have been more than just the 300.
Okay.
They all die, and then the Persian army begins to move through Greece, and they sack Athens. They destroy Athens, and then they kind of start conquering some of the other Greek city-states, and then they retreat and they flee. But then the Persian army leads a contingent of like a smaller army in Greece to deal with the rest of the Greek city-states, and then the Persian army goes back to Persia. They think that's because the supply lines couldn't supply them for so long, so they have a smaller contingent that can kind of live off the land. The rest of the army, he's also the king of Persia. He's far away from his capital, so they've kind of extended their reach for this time period. They all go back to Persia, and then about a year later is when they have this Battle of Plataea, where the Spartan-led army and all the Greek city-states are there in full force, and they beat the Persian army at the Battle of Plataea and expel them from Greece, and it ends the Greco-Persian War. There's also another naval battle at Salamis that the Greeks win, and that kind of keeps the Persians out of Greece for the foreseeable future, and the Greeks win. The Greeks win almost all of the Greco-Persian wars. And it's crazy because the Persian army is massive. They've got great cavalry. They've got great bow fire. But for whatever reason, every time there's a pitched battle, now Thermopylae is a pitched battle that the Greeks lose, but they were beat. It's only because of this path that they can get around and surround them that they're able to really beat them. The Greek hoplite, the heavy infantry, was something that the Persians could just never deal with, and it goes like that all the way through Alexander the Great's time, when his Macedonian phalanxes, which are different, they operate differently than the kind of Spartan phalanx, but they're heavy infantry as well, and the Persians just can't really get a handle on it. They never are able to really fight them very well.
Are they littler men?
They might be, but I mean, all humans were smaller at this point, so it's really the armor and the spear that are the great equalizers with the numbers.
Right.
Because the Greek spears are longer than the Persian spears, and the Greek armor is better than the Persian armor. Some of the Persian troops are wearing no armor, and their shields are kind of like wicker shields, and their spears are short, kind of javelin-y spears. And if they are wearing armor, it's like quilted armor. And now some are wearing more traditional style metal types of armor, but their army's so huge, not all their troops have armor.
Would the soldiers on both sides at this time still just be men? There were no women that would fight?
No women.
Okay.
Yeah, no women at all on the battlefield at this time. Now, the Spartan women do have more freedoms than the rest of the Greek city-states, but you wouldn't view it as like any modern type of freedom.
Right.
I mean, like, it was, in Athens, if a man was like, I mean, I'm trying to remember how it goes, but like, if a woman was like raped by a man, she couldn't even like accuse him in the courts, and if she did, she'd be like stoned to death or something like that. In Sparta, the women could fight off the men from that sort of thing, and then if the man was caught, he'd be killed for doing that. So there are, that's kind of an extreme example of the rights of women in Sparta, but they had more rights than women throughout.
More respected.
Yeah, more respected. But also, like I said, massive amounts of slaves, men, women, children, all in Sparta.
Did that, there was that father and son that were in the 300. Did they exist?
I don't think so. I think they're made up characters. Some of the Spartans, like I said, they're based on, other than Leonidas of the 300, the rest of them are all just kind of loosely based on some of the actual characters. Michael Fassbender's character is based on a real Spartan who said some of those lines. Faramir's character is based on a real Spartan who survived the battle, later on, and things like that. So overall, the movie 300 gets a lot of the big points right? Like, They kick the Persians down the well. He goes to the oracle at Delphi. He takes his 300 Spartans to Thermopylae. They build the wall. They fight the Persians there, and they hold them off until they're able to get surrounded. The terrain is all amplified, but still...
So is everything else.
So is everything else, right? So the movie does get a lot right. It's just how crazy the right things are that they're doing, and they twist and get all of those things wrong. So from a historical timeline perspective, it's fairly accurate. It's just the rippling 8-packs covered in coconut oil and no armor, and the Persian rhinos, or the Persian goat-headed guy playing the flute, or Xerxes.
Were they all like the Persians decorated with all that jewelry as they were?
But that is... There is some historical evidence to that, because the Persians were always kind of seen as decadent to the Greeks, and like the Persians would wear like eyeliner and things like that. But societies throughout the Middle East and Africa, they all did. The Egyptians did, all of that kind of thing. So in their cultures, that's not seen as effeminate, but to the Greeks, it is.
What is Persia now?
Persia is Iran now. So if you're, the kingdom of Persia was massive. It's basically all of the Middle East, plus Egypt and Turkey.
Okay.
So that whole area was the Persian Empire. But if you're looking at it from a modern day perspective, the people of Iran would consider themselves Persian.
Okay.
I went to school with a girl. Her family was from Iran, and when I asked her like, "Oh, what's your heritage?" She said, "Oh, we're Persian." So they still consider themselves Persian to this day. Now, there's obviously lots of different groups of people in Iran in and of itself, but a large population of the Iranian people all consider themselves Persian and have Persian heritage. So that is kind of the end of the story of the Battle of Thermopylae, and we'll just kind of go into some of the things that we thought about that versus the movie, and what you thought about it and things like that. So what are some of your thoughts, questions, surprises? Not surprised?
Yeah, I guess I don't really have very many surprises from what you've told me, I don't think. It was obvious kind of that everything was kind of way, way more dramatic than it would have been.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I feel a bit more educated, but obviously the big surprise was that this was something that was pretty kind of true.
Yeah.
It happened. When I said at the beginning, I thought that that it was so far-fetched that I would never have thought it was based on a true story.
I think the biggest surprise is that when you get past the kind of glossy, veneer that is the 300 cinematography, they still get a lot right. They still, they kind of rearrange a few things, and everything's kind of amped up and overly dramatic and stuff like that. But they actually got a lot right. So, when you watch the movie, you'd be like, oh my goodness, they're going to do this kind of style of the Battle of Thermopylae, which is super, super famous. It's like, it's going to be terrible.
Right.
And they're going to get nothing right. And then you look at it and you're like, oh, well, they kind of got that right, and they kind of got that right, and they kind of got that right, and they said this, and they actually said that, and they said this, and they actually said that,
Yeah.
So
that's pretty surprising. I wouldn't have guessed that those little one-liners were true.
So, like, when you look at this movie compared to, like, the Battle of the Bulge movie, historically speaking, it's a lot more accurate. Whereas the Battle of the Bulge has, like, the right uniforms and some of the right guns and things like that. It's kind of flip-flopped. They get all the kind of smaller details wrong in the 300, but they get all the big details right.
Which way around do you prefer it to be?
I would prefer if they just did both of them. And
got it all right.
Got it all right. But I can kind of forgive 300 for its inaccuracies, because it's also based on the graphic novel, right? So they're kind of retelling that kind of fanciful version of it. And one of the things that they said in making of the movie is that it's a retelling by Faramir's character to a group of soldiers on the eve of a battle. So just like we talked about Herodotus talking about how he exaggerates everything in his histories, they kind of looked at it from the point of view that this guy's trying to amp them up for battle the next morning. So when he's telling them this story, he's going to put in the rhino and he's going to put in the giants. And now the immortals are monsters to try and be like, hey, we're not fighting humans tomorrow. We're fighting monsters. Let's go defend Sparta. Let's go defend Greece. You know, like, so that's kind of how they kind of got around that. That it's this retelling and he's going to, you know, exaggerate and amplify to make the story more entertaining to the soldiers before they go into battle tomorrow. And I can kind of get that. I can respect that aspect of it.
Or just, you know, that whole Chinese whispers effect of any story, that it gets told and told and told and told and told again as well. And...
Wait, what do y'all call that game?
Chinese whispers.
Chinese whispers?
Yeah.
We call it telephone.
Oh. I don't know why we call it Chinese whispers.
But yes, yeah, exactly like that. The myths build over time.
They get a bit more exaggerated and a bit more off each time.
Yeah. Just like the Spartans themselves, mainly from this battle, I think, me personally, I think the Spartans are right up there with samurai as the most overrated fighting force of all time. Of all time. And that is a lot to do with this movie and a lot to do with this historical battle of them dying in the last stand and killing a whole bunch of Persians and things like that. Now, that is not to say that I don't think the Spartans were good warriors. They were. I just think the myth of the Spartans has gotten so large that they are one of the most overrated forces of all time. At this time, one of the reasons for this myth is there's a scene where he's like, you know, what's your profession? He's like, I'm a potter, you know, I'm a blacksmith, you know, and I cradle babies, you know, and everything like that. And he's like, Spartans! And then they all, you know, hoo-ah. He's like, I brought more soldiers. That is rooted in reality. At this time, all of the Greek city-states would have been civilian militia. So when the war comes, the call goes out, and the farmers and the potters and the blacksmiths...
So the Spartans were actually warriors.
The Spartans were actually warriors, and they're the only Greek city-state at this time that had a professional army. And so up until a later date, the Spartans were the cream of the crop. And even some of the Persian army, right? We talked about the immortals may only being the professional contingent of that army and the rest kind of citizen, you know, militias that have been called up to fight. So when you've got untrained men fighting men who have spent their whole lives training, they are going to be better. They are going to be more elite. And it's like that with anything. So later on in history, when the Greek city-states are at war with each other, Sparta in the initial phases spanks them, especially on the land battles. They just destroy all of these city-states, and they're the strongest power in the area. Later on, when I say later on, I mean like 100 and some odd years later, some of these other Greek city-states start to professionalize their soldiers, but not quite with that like a Gogi training, just making them professional. And the Spartans start to lose some battles. Now they're still tough and they still fight hard and they still win some as well. But it's kind of proven that you don't need a 7-year-old's military training to start at that time and beat them and everything like that, because Spartan military prowess is defeated by professional soldiers who don't go through that same Agoge process. And the kind of Spartan myth is broken multiple times by certain armies.
What about the Spartan women? Do they really are they really stronger than all other women, and they are the only ones that give birth to?
That's a real line too. She actually said that.
Really?
Yeah, so not to the Persian messenger. She says it to like an Athenian or something like that in real life. But that queen actually says that line to a real person, that only Spartan women give birth to real men, and that's one of the reasons why the women get more rights, you know, than some of the other.
They're respected in that way.
They're respected because, hey, our Spartan warriors come from these Spartan women, so we give them a few more rights and a few more respect than the other Greek city-states. So another great one-liner from from the Greek queen. Another little thing that's not mentioned in the movie that's just kind of an interesting tidbit is that Sparta has 2 kings at all times. So there's another Spartan king in power when Leonidas goes off to war. And there's these 2 kind of historical lines that they both derive themselves from Hercules and these other kind of the age of heroes and mythical Greece and Perseus and all of that, and so they each kind of claim lineage from a different hero, and Leonidas's lineage was seen as the superior line of kings during that time, and that's why he's kind of the one in charge, even though yes, there is another king.
Another bit of the cinematography that I quite liked was that scene with the Oracle, where she was like floating around, and it was clear that it was done underwater.
They filmed it underwater.
But I don't think I've seen that before.
No, I mean the movie's beautiful, and I mean especially like the landscape shots when they're walking through the wheat and things like that. I think the movie's beautifully done. It's just got a lot of the little tiny things that are historically inaccurate. Anything else you want to talk about? Anything else that stood out to you about the movie or history in general, or just anything like that? Oh, I have something. So when we talked about the Persian army marching overland, I meant to talk about this earlier, but I kind of forgot. But it's super cool. It's a super cool thing that the Persian army does and the capabilities of this large empire. I talked about in the Ionian Revolt episode about the capabilities that it's almost modern in terms of what they're able to do and how far they're able to march and how many reinforcements and armies they can put into the field after, they lost this battle, another army, lose this battle, another army, this fleet gets sunk, another fleet, it's extremely impressive. The Spartans and the Greeks would not be able to do to Persia what Persia is doing to Greece. They do not have the ability to send an army and conquer Persia. I mean, they could go over there, and later on they do, but they don't do anything. They get defeated. And so when Xerxes is preparing to march his army to Athens or into just Greece proper in general, he's learned from the first two invasions, right? The first invasion, that the Persian fleet gets sunk around that Mount Athos because the waters are so treacherous and the storms over there, and they go, instead of having to go the long way around up to kind of modern day Istanbul and cross there, they're going to cross at the Hellespont, which is that little strip of land that I showed you. Yeah. They build 2 bridges across that water where the army can march across, and horses, they take these boats and they basically make a pontoon bridge across the Hellespont, put dirt and wood all over the bridge and make a bridge and then cross it, so they cut off this whole area that they have to march around. So then the army's marching around the coastline, and the navy is kind of paralleling them for supplies and things like that. Well, when they get to the Mount Athos area, instead of going around and risking all of his ships again, they dig a canal and cut off Mount Athos from the rest of Greece so they can sail their ships through it and just bypass all of that treacherous. Okay. And for a long, long time, they thought that was made up. They didn't think that the Persians had the ability to dig canals like that, especially on camp.
But they had an awful lot of slaves, didn't they?
Yes, they had slaves too, but they didn't have the technology or the ability to do that on campaign. They could do those types of things like back home, but when the military's on campaign, But an archaeological team went there and found the evidence of the canal that they actually had dug, and there's still some of it that you can see where it kind of enters and exits on both sides of the little peninsula. So they actually did that, and they sailed down through it. It's super impressive. It's really, really cool that the Persian army is able to do these great feats. And we talked about it in the Ionian Revolt, how like from our mindset, the Western mindset, the Greeks are always the good guys. And in some ways, I still, no matter what, will always view the Spartans and the Greeks as the good guys because they're defending their homeland. They don't want to be conquered. That's something I think that we can all respect. But the Persians are always seen as these enslavers and these tyrannical rulers and the evil empire. The Darth Vader and the Hitler of the ancient world. But the Persians are always kind of seen as the lenient rulers, the gracious rulers. And you'll see later on that there's Athenian rulers and Spartan rulers that get exiled or kicked out for various reasons in the Greek city-states. They all flee to Persia, and the Persians are like, yeah, come on. You'll be a general in my army, and I'll give you. They don't just enslave them. No, they don't enslave them. They all live these great lives in Persia after they get kicked out of the Greek city-states because Themistocles, the Athenian general who does the naval battles during this time, he's like a hero of Athens and helps. He kind of came up with this overall strategy and things like that. the ruling elites in Athens begin to not like him. And they trump up some charges, false charges, and they like exile him out of Athens. So the guy who helped save Greece gets kicked out of it, goes to Persia. The Persian king's like, yeah, come on, I'll make you a ruler of this county, or I'll give you this city to be a governor of, and I'll make you rich. And he's like, all right, cool. And goes and lives off this great life in Persia afterwards.
Wow.
You know, so yeah, it's just kind of funny and just a little bit more context on, you know, they're not just these kind of faceless monsters. They did have culture, and they did have good and bad things about them, you know, that kind of a thing. But although they get a lot wrong in the movie, I still enjoy 300. It's one of the first of its kind. It was so big when it came out, so I still enjoy watching it, even though they get a lot of the little things wrong. Anything else?
I don't think so.
Right.
Covered lots.
Yeah, I think that's going to cover it for this episode of the Based on History podcast. Don't forget to follow us on Spotify, leave a review, tell all your friends about it, tell everyone about it. We really appreciate everyone who already has and who's been spreading the word. Follow us on Instagram.
Let us know if you know why it was called a lizard head.
Yeah. Oh, and also let me know if there's anything I got wrong. You know, we'll talk about the things I got wrong on the 300 episode in the next one. And we hope everyone's doing well, and we'll see you next time on the Based on History podcast. Adios.